Royal courts have always presented themselves as places of order, ceremony, and control. The historical record around drugs and poison tells a messier story, one that runs from ancient Pontus to the Vatican of the 19th century, by way of Versailles, Constantinople, and the Mughal court at Agra. Royal security has never only meant bodyguards or food tasters. In the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a kingdom on the Black Sea in what is now northern Turkey, decided that the safest way to survive his own court was to poison himself on purpose every single day. His father had likely been murdered with poison, arranged from inside his own family, and his mother had reportedly favored his brother for the throne instead of him. Growing up under that kind of suspicion convinced Mithridates that the next attempt on his life would come from someone close to him, served quietly in his food or his wine. Tasting a ruler's food before he ate, it was already common practice in royal courts across the ancient world by that point, but Mithridates wanted protection that worked even on the days a taster was not available or could be bribed. This was not a man inclined toward half measures. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, Mithridates once ordered the killing of as many as 150,000 Roman and Italian civilians living in Asia Minor in a single day, during one of his wars against Rome. Against that kind of figure, a personal habit of poisoning himself a little at a time looks almost restrained. He began taking small, carefully increasing doses of known poisons, building tolerance over years, a practice that still carries his name today. Mithridatism. Alongside this routine, he developed a formula of his own, a daily mixture of dozens of plant extracts, minerals, and animal-derived ingredients meant to protect him against any poison he had not already built immunity to. He called it Mithridatism. Decades of this regimen apparently worked too well. When the Roman general Pompey finally cornered him in 63 BCE and defeat became certain, Mithridates tried to end his own life with poison. It did not work. According to the ancient historians who recorded his final hours, his body had absorbed so many sublethal doses over the decades that the lethal dose he needed simply failed to act. He had to ask his own bodyguard, a Gallic officer named Bituitus, to finish the job with a sword. Pompey's troops recovered the antidote formula afterward, reportedly written in Mithridates' own hand, and carried it back to Rome, where it was translated into Latin and treated as a genuine military prize. It became one of the most valuable pieces of medical knowledge in the ancient world, and it did not stay unchanged for long. The Roman Emperor Nero later asked his own physician, Andromachus, to refine the original recipe. Andromachus replaced one of its more obscure ingredients, a lizard called a skink, believed at the time to carry some natural defense against poison, with the flesh of a viper, since vipers were assumed to hold an internal resistance to their own venom. The new version was called Theriac, and it would remain in continuous medical use for roughly the next 1800 years. What rarely gets mentioned about Theriac is everything else inside it besides viper flesh and honey. Galen, who became personal physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 169 CE, turned Theriac into the most influential medical preparation of his era. In his own treatises, including works titled On Antidotes and On Theriac, addressed to Piso, Galen described a base formula of viper's flesh, opium, honey, wine, and cinnamon, combined with more than 70 additional ingredients and left to mature for years before use. He claimed the finished compound could draw poison out of the body the way a cupping glass drew blood to the skin, and that it healed abscesses faster than a surgeon's blade could. The exact ingredient list shifted depending on who wrote it down. The Roman writer Celsus recorded 38 components in the 1st century CE. Pliny the Elder counted 54 a few decades later, and Galen's own version eventually settled closer to 60. Marcus Aurelius took a dose of it daily, specifically for protection against poison and for general health, according to the medical writing of the period. Modern historians who have studied the formula generally agree that the actual amount of opium in each daily serving was too small to have caused Marcus Aurelius any meaningful intoxication, even after years of continuous use. Not everyone in antiquity was convinced Theriac worked at all. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder looked at its growing ingredient list and called it, in his own words, an obvious display of skill for its own sake. His skepticism did not slow anything down. Daily consumption of Theriac or Mithridatism, taken specifically as protection against assassination, became standard practice for monarchs and aristocrats across the Mediterranean world and later across medieval and Renaissance Europe, particularly in Italy and France, where versions of the formula stayed in continuous use among the nobility for centuries. By the time the recipe reached the court of Louis XIV in France, in the second half of the 17th century, it had survived roughly 1,700 years without anyone seriously testing whether it worked as advertised. A physician at the French court named Daquin took on the task of standardizing the formula yet again, producing what was considered, at the time, the definitive version. It would take another century before anyone in a position of authority seriously questioned the whole premise. In 1799, a committee of physicians was formally established to examine new medical preparations before they reached the public, a direct response to centuries of products like Theriac being sold and consumed purely on reputation, with no one checking whether the formula on the label matched what was actually inside the jar. Historians of pharmacology generally treat that committee as one of the earliest building blocks of modern drug regulation. The key point, though, is what happened in France more than a century before that committee existed. Louis XIV, protected daily by an opium-containing formula meant to guard him against poison, still lived through one of the most notorious poisoning scandals in European history, generated entirely from inside his own palace. In 1676, a noblewoman named Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, known as the Marquise de Brinvilliers, was tried and executed for poisoning her own father and two brothers with arsenic supplied to her by her lover. On its own, the case might have stayed a private family tragedy, but Nicolas de la Reynie, the head of the Paris police, kept investigating, because the methods used in the Brinvilliers case matched patterns he had started noticing elsewhere in the city. His inquiry eventually led to a woman named Catherine Deschailles, known across Paris as La Voisin, who ran a network of fortune-tellers and chemists, supplying what people at the time called inheritance powders, doses of arsenic, sometimes disguised inside cosmetics, sold to clients who wanted to remove a relative or a rival standing between them and a title or a fortune. Once the scandal received its formal name, the affair of the poisons, the list of clients named under interrogation stretched into the hundreds, and several of them held positions at the very top of French society. Among the names raised was Madame de Montespan, Louise's own official mistress, accused of buying potions and possibly taking part in occult rituals intended to secure the king's continued affection. Louis created a special tribunal, the Chambre Ardente, to handle the cases. Between 1679 and 1682, it examined more than 400 suspects and sent at least 36 people to their deaths. The investigation stopped, conveniently close to the point where it would have required formally charging Montespan herself. The same king whose physician maintained a daily formula against poison, descended from a paranoid ruler 17 centuries earlier, ended up running a poison investigation inside his own palace, and closing it the moment it threatened to reach his own mistress. According to several historians who have studied his reign, Louis grew noticeably more suspicious of the people around him once the investigation closed, and restricted access to his private quarters in a way he had not bothered with before the scandal. While European courts spent centuries fearing poison and consuming opium disguised as protection from it, the Mughal court in India was consuming the same substance for a very different reason: long-standing regional habit, recreational enjoyment, and very little serious effort from anyone in power to stop it. Opium had been part of elite Central Asian culture for generations before the Mughals ever arrived in India, particularly among the Timurid dynasty the family descended from, and they appear to have carried the habit with them across the mountains into the subcontinent. By the time Akbar ruled the empire in the second half of the 16th century, opium was formally recorded as a trade good in the Ain-i-Akbari, the detailed administrative record kept during his reign, which also notes its presence inside the royal court itself. Akbar's son and successor took the regnal name Jahangir, meaning World Caesar, and ended up dependent on something considerably smaller than a world, a daily dose of opium dissolved in liquid. Jahangir kept up the habit for most of his 22-year reign, from 1605 to 1627, and historians studying his own memoirs, the Tuzuki Jahangiri, count repeated references to opium throughout the text. For long stretches of his rule, day-to-day administration of the empire fell to his wife Nur Jahan, while Jahangir stayed out of public view. Nur Jahan's role went beyond paperwork. When a rebel commander named Mahabat Khan attempted to seize Jahangir during a later succession crisis, it was Nur Jahan who organized the rescue operation, reportedly directing one of the attacking units herself from the back of a war elephant. In 1618, Jahangir wrote about the death of a close courtier named Inayat Khan, who had wasted away after combining opium with wine use. Jahangir described him as one of his closest servants even while recording the physical decline that the combination had caused. Opium use at the Mughal court extended beyond one ruler. Akbar himself reportedly used it. Babur and Humayun, Jahangir's grandfather and great-grandfather, are described in several historical accounts as sharing opium with their nobles during gatherings and military campaigns, despite a formal prohibition on intoxicants under Islamic law that the dynasty otherwise claimed to follow. Jahangir's own son, Shah Jahan, the emperor remembered for building the Taj Mahal in memory of his wife Mumtaz Mahal, is also described in several historical accounts as having increased his own opium use following her death. Not every depiction of opium at the Mughal court was grim. Court paintings from the period show two very different scenes side by side. One from around 1618 depicting a courtier wasting away from the habit, and another from around 1750 showing a relaxed gathering of nobles, mystics, and clerics, sharing opium or cannabis together while being served fruit and bread, with nothing about the scene suggesting decline or disgrace. A similar contradiction between official religious law and private royal habit showed up just as clearly inside the Ottoman court in Constantinople, though the response there was considerably harsher once a case became public. Officially, the Ottoman state enforced restrictions on alcohol, opium, and tobacco rooted in Islamic legal tradition. And the sultan most associated with enforcing those restrictions by force was Murad IV, who ruled the empire from 1623 to 1640. In 1623, Murad ordered every coffeehouse in the capital shut down, since coffeehouses had become the social centers where wine, tobacco, and opium circulated, alongside conversation and games like chess. He did not stop at issuing the decree. Multiple historical accounts describe him personally patrolling the streets of the city at night, sometimes in disguise, to catch violators directly, despite the fact that some accounts also describe Murad himself using opium as a young prince, years before he became the empire's most aggressive enforcer against it. One incident involving his own court physician, a man named Emir Salebi, is recorded across several sources. Salebi was suspected of opium addiction, and, according to these accounts, Murad invited him to a long game of chess specifically to observe him. As the game continued, Salebi began sweating, flushing, and trembling, exposing the addiction. When he was searched and opium was found on him, Murad forced Salebi to consume the entire amount in his possession on the spot. Salebi fell into a coma and died the same night. It is worth adding a note of caution here, one that some specialists in Ottoman legal history raise directly. Incidents like Salebi's are documented precisely because they were dramatic exceptions, not because intoxicant use was common at every level of Ottoman society. A vivid anecdote being well recorded is not the same thing as a habit being widespread, and several historians studying Ottoman court records have pushed back specifically against the assumption that alcohol, opium, and cannabis use were normal or unremarkable parts of everyday palace life. What is well documented, separately from any individual case, is that opium and cannabis cultivation remained a steady, taxed part of the Ottoman economy throughout the empire's history, grown and traded for medical use even while consumption for pleasure stayed officially condemned. Tobacco followed an almost identical pattern after arriving from the Americas in the 16th century, initially marketed across Europe as a cure for everything from headaches to more serious illness, only adopted by Ottoman elites afterward, and then targeted by the same kind of official disapproval. The water pipe itself had entered the empire generations before Murad's crackdown, arriving from Persia during the reign of Selim I in the early 16th century. Istanbul even had a market street nicknamed the Addict Market, lined with shops near the coffee houses where the habit proved hardest to eliminate. By the second half of the 19th century, the relationship between royal courts and drugs had changed almost completely. What earlier centuries hid, denied, or punished, the era of Queen Victoria and the modern advertising industry turned into something openly celebrated and sold under a brand name. In 1863, a French chemist named Angelo Mariani, inspired by a paper the Italian scientist Paolo Mantegazza had published 4 years earlier on the effects of coca leaf, began selling a tonic made from Bordeaux wine infused with coca. Each fluid ounce of the standard version contained around 6 milligrams of cocaine, drawn out of the leaf by the alcohol in the wine itself. The version exported abroad carried slightly more, to compete with stronger American products already on the market. The alcohol in the wine did more than extract the cocaine. When cocaine and alcohol are consumed together, the body produces a third compound called cocaethylene, which research has since shown is both more pleasurable and more damaging to the heart than cocaine taken on its own, a chemical detail nobody buying the tonic in the 1880s had any way of knowing. Mariani called his product Vin Mariani, marketed it as a remedy for fatigue, poor digestion, and a long list of other complaints, and built one of the most aggressive celebrity endorsement campaigns of the era around it. Many of the physicians who later praised the tonic in print had first received a free bottle directly from Mariani himself, and the company eventually compiled the most flattering of these endorsements into a promotional book it called Portraits from Album Mariani. Queen Victoria reportedly drank it regularly. American presidents Ulysses Grant and William McKinley were both users. Grant is said to have relied on it while finishing his memoirs in the final months of his life. The inventor Thomas Edison credited it with letting him work longer hours. Writers including Alexandre Dumas, Jules Verne, and Émile Zola agreed to have their names used in advertisements for it, and the actress Sarah Bernhardt did the same. The most striking endorsement of all came from the Vatican. Pope Leo XIII reportedly carried a personal flask of Vin Mariani and was quoted describing it as something he turned to when prayer alone was not enough to get him through the day. He went further than simply drinking it. He awarded Angelo Mariani an official Vatican gold medal in recognition of the tonic's benefits, and his successor, Pope Pius X, continued drinking it as well. A medical trade publication from 1890 stated that, among preparations recognized by physicians of the period, none had received a stronger endorsement from the medical profession than Vin Mariani. A bottle of the wine produced in 1914 survived long enough to be analyzed by Yale University researchers in 1987, who confirmed it still contained measurable cocaine more than 70 years after it was bottled. None of it lasted. As public and medical understanding of cocaine's risks grew over the following decades, the tonic that had once carried a papal medal became a regulatory target instead. In the United States, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act required accurate labeling of ingredients in food and drink, undermining a product that depended on vague claims about a mysterious tonic effect. And the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Tax Act placed direct federal controls on cocaine and opiates, ending the era of openly sold coca wine for good. Vin Mariani's most famous American imitator had already adjusted years earlier. A pharmacist in Atlanta named John Pemberton, who had based his own 1886 recipe directly on Mariani's formula, eventually removed the coca-derived cocaine from his drink and kept selling it under the name it still carries today, Coca-Cola. Looking across all of it, from a king on the Black Sea poisoning himself on purpose to guard against poison, to a sitting pope keeping a flask of cocaine wine inside his own robes, the same basic pattern repeats across roughly 2,000 years and several unrelated empires. Royal and religious authority never stopped courts from using drugs. In most of these cases, that authority is precisely what allowed each version of the habit to survive as long as it did. A viper flesh antidote outlasted the empire that invented it by more than a millennium. An opium-dependent emperor still governed a territory larger than most of Europe for over 2 decades. A sitting pope handed out an official medal for a product that the United States would, within decades of his own death, place under federal narcotics law. The fear of poison that started this entire chain of habits with Mithridates never actually disappeared either. It reappeared almost 18 centuries later, inside the court of the most powerful king in Europe, in an investigation that nearly reached his own mistress before it was quietly shut down. Every one of these courts believed, at least for a while, that they had found something that gave them an advantage over the people around them: protection, focus, energy, or straightforward enjoyment. In every single case on record, the substance eventually shaped the decisions of the people who believed they were the ones controlling it. None of these courts thought of themselves as an exception to the pattern. Each one assumed in its own time that its formula, its faith, or its laws made it different from all the others.